21 black actors who lost a child in tragic accidents. Some of these celebrities survived prison, addiction, violence, bankruptcy, and years of public humiliation. But the one thing that truly destroyed them was losing their own child. Behind the fame, luxury mansions, sold-out concerts, and championship trophies were grieving parents crying behind closed doors while the world continued watching them like entertainment. From Mike Tyson and Bobby Brown to Dr. Dre, Master P, and John Travolta, these heartbreaking stories reveal how quickly life can change in a single phone call, accident, overdose, or act of violence. And once you hear what really happened to their children, you may never look at these celebrities the same way again. Before we begin, tell us in the comments which story shocked you the most. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join Memory Lane Black People for more emotional, untold celebrity stories. Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson spent most of his life looking invincible. Born in Brooklyn in 1966 and raised in poverty, Tyson rose from troubled streets to become the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history at just 20 years old. His terrifying speed, knockout power, and aggressive fighting style turned him into a global phenomenon during the late 1980s. Millions watched in shock as opponents collapsed within minutes under Tyson's punches. To the public, he looked fearless, a man capable of destroying anyone standing in front of him. But outside the ring, Tyson's life was filled with emotional instability, legal trouble, addiction, and personal pain. Fame arrived so fast that he often seemed overwhelmed by it. After the death of his mentor, Cus D'Amato, Tyson's life gradually spiraled into chaos. Prison, failed relationships, financial collapse, and substance abuse followed him through the years, while the world continued treating him as entertainment rather than a deeply wounded man. Then came the tragedy that broke him in a way no opponent ever could. On May 26, 2009, Tyson's 4-year-old daughter, Exodus Tyson, died in a horrifying accident inside the family home in Phoenix, Arizona. While playing near a treadmill, a hanging cord wrapped around her neck and caused fatal injuries. By the time she was discovered and rushed to the hospital, the damage was irreversible. The loss devastated Tyson completely. Friends later described him as emotionally shattered, carrying unbearable guilt and grief after the accident. Tyson himself admitted the pain changed him forever. A man once feared across the world suddenly looked broken, vulnerable, and lost. For years afterward, he rarely discussed Exodus publicly because the emotional wound remained too deep. What makes Tyson's story so heartbreaking is the contrast between his public image and private suffering. The world knew the fighter who knocked people unconscious in seconds. But behind that terrifying reputation stood a grieving father who discovered there is no strength powerful enough to protect someone from losing a child. Bill Cosby. Before scandal permanently damaged his reputation, Bill Cosby was once viewed as one of the most respected figures in American entertainment. Born in Philadelphia in 1937, Cosby became a television pioneer through comedy, acting, and groundbreaking success with The Cosby Show. During the 1980s, millions of families welcomed him into their homes every week, seeing him as the image of wisdom, stability, and fatherhood. His influence on black television history was enormous, helping reshape how black families were portrayed in mainstream American media. But behind the fame and success came a tragedy that shattered him personally long before his public downfall years later. On January 16, 1997, Cosby's only son, Ennis Cosby, was murdered beside a Los Angeles freeway at just 27 years old. Ennis, a graduate student known for his kindness and intelligence, had stopped to fix a flat tire late at night when he was confronted during a robbery attempt and shot to death. The murder shocked the nation. Ennis had reportedly cooperated fully, yet he was killed anyway in a senseless act of violence. For Bill Cosby, the pain became unbearable. Friends described him collapsing emotionally after hearing the news. The man audiences knew as calm, composed, and humorous suddenly became a grieving father, facing the kind of nightmare no amount of wealth or fame could prevent. Although the killer was eventually arrested and convicted, nothing could repair the emotional damage left behind. People close to Cosby later said Ennis's death permanently changed him. Behind the public image of success was a father haunted by the final moments of a son he deeply loved and believed had a bright future ahead. What makes the tragedy especially painful is that Ennis Cosby was killed during an ordinary moment, simply stopping beside the road to change a tire. In a matter of seconds, an entire family's world collapsed forever. Dr. Dre. Dr. Dre built an empire from sound, discipline, and ambition. Born Andre Young in Compton, California in 1965, Dre became one of the most influential figures in music history through NWA, Death Row Records, and later, Aftermath Entertainment. He helped launch the careers of legends like Snoop Dogg, Eminem, and 50 Cent, while creating albums that shaped hip-hop for decades. By the 2000s, Dr. Dre was no longer just a producer. He was a billionaire-level businessman and cultural icon admired around the world. To the public, Dre looked calm, powerful, and completely in control. But behind the success was a father carrying private pain that few fans truly understood. On August 23, 2008, Dre's son, Andre Young Jr., was found dead at his mother's home in Los Angeles at only 20 years old. Reports later confirmed the cause was a fatal overdose involving heroin and morphine. The tragedy shocked fans because Andre Jr. was still incredibly young, with his entire life ahead of him. Friends described him as quiet, talented, and deeply loved by his family. For Dr. Dre, the loss became devastatingly personal. A man who spent decades building success suddenly faced something money, fame, and influence could not fix. Unlike many celebrities, Dre chose to grieve privately. He rarely discussed his son publicly, which made the tragedy feel even heavier. People close to him later suggested the loss deeply affected him emotionally, though he continued working and maintaining his public image. What makes this story especially heartbreaking is the silence surrounding it. Behind the luxury, awards, and billion-dollar business deals stood a grieving father forced to live with the reality that addiction had stolen his son forever. In the end, Dr. Dre's tragedy reminds people that even the most powerful men can become completely helpless when faced with the death of a child. Bobby Brown. Bobby Brown's life has been filled with fame, controversy, addiction, and unimaginable loss. Born in Boston in 1969, Bobby rose to stardom as a member of New Edition before launching a wildly successful solo career with hits like My Prerogative and Every Little Step. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, he became one of R&B's biggest stars, known for his charisma, rebellious personality, and high-energy performances. His marriage to Whitney Houston only increased public fascination with his life. But behind the celebrity image was a man battling addiction, emotional instability, and years of personal tragedy. Bobby's struggles with drugs and alcohol became highly publicized over time, damaging both his career and relationships. Yet nothing prepared him for the devastating losses that would follow later in life. After Whitney Houston's death in 2012 and the tragic passing of their daughter Bobby Christina Brown in 2015, Bobby suffered another unbearable heartbreak. On November 18, 2020, his son Bobby Brown Jr. was found dead inside his Los Angeles apartment at age 28. Toxicology reports later confirmed a deadly combination of alcohol, cocaine, and fentanyl contributed to his death. The tragedy completely shattered Bobby emotionally. Friends described him as exhausted, devastated, and overwhelmed by grief after burying yet another child. Many people saw a man trying desperately to hold himself together while repeatedly losing the people he loved most. What makes Bobby Brown's story so painful is the pattern of loss surrounding his life. Fame brought wealth and recognition, but it also came alongside addiction, chaos, and heartbreak that never truly disappeared. Behind the music and scandals stood a father forced to endure grief again and again while the public watched from a distance. Master P. Master P spent decades building an empire through discipline, ambition, and survival instincts learned from the streets of New Orleans. Born Percy Miller in 1970, he transformed himself from a struggling entrepreneur into one of the most successful independent figures in hip-hop history. Through No Limit Records, Master P sold millions of albums, launched business ventures across music, film, clothing, and sports management, and became a symbol of Black financial success during the 1990s. To fans, he looked strong, fearless, and completely in control of his world. But behind the business success was a father watching his daughter slowly lose a painful battle with addiction. On May 29, 2022, Master P's daughter, Tatiana Miller, died at just 25 years old from an accidental overdose involving fentanyl and other substances. The tragedy devastated the entire family because Tatiana had reportedly struggled privately with emotional pain and substance abuse for years. Unlike many celebrity families who hide personal struggles, Master P later spoke openly about the dangers of drugs and mental health, admitting he felt helpless watching addiction destroy someone he deeply loved. Friends described him as emotionally shattered after her death. A man who had survived poverty, violence, and the ruthless music industry suddenly faced grief he could not fight with money, influence, or determination. What made the situation even more heartbreaking was how young Tatiana still was. She had dreams, ambitions, and people who believed she could still recover. But addiction moved faster than hope. Master P later shared emotional tributes online, describing his daughter as irreplaceable and admitting the pain never truly leaves. Behind the image of the successful businessman stood a grieving father carrying guilt, heartbreak, and unanswered questions. Master P's story reminds people that even those who appear powerful and successful can still lose the battle against the hidden destruction addiction brings into families every single day. O.J. Simpson. Before his name became permanently tied to scandal and controversy, O.J. Simpson was once viewed as one of the most celebrated athletes in America. Born in San Francisco in 1947, Simpson rose from poverty to become a football superstar, Hollywood actor, and national celebrity. During the 1970s, his speed and charisma turned him into an NFL icon, while television commercials and movie appearances made him one of the most recognizable Black celebrities in the country. To millions of people, O.J. Simpson represented success, fame, and the achievement of the American dream. But behind the glamorous public image was a tragedy that deeply scarred him years before the infamous murder trial that later consumed his life. On August 26, 1979, Simpson's 2-year-old daughter, Erin Simpson, drowned in the family swimming pool at their Los Angeles home. Reports stated the little girl had been found unconscious in the water before being rushed to the hospital, where doctors fought desperately to save her life. After several days on life support, she died from respiratory failure caused by the near-drowning accident. The loss devastated Simpson and his family. Friends later described him as emotionally broken after Erin's death, though he rarely discussed the tragedy publicly. Unlike the confident superstar audiences saw on television, he became a grieving father, haunted by the sudden death of a child barely old enough to understand the world around her. What makes the tragedy especially painful is how ordinary the moment seemed before everything changed. A peaceful afternoon at home suddenly turned into a nightmare that never truly disappeared from the family's memory. Although O.J. Simpson's later legal scandals overshadowed much of his public image, the loss of Erin remained one of the darkest and most heartbreaking moments of his private life. A reminder that behind fame and celebrity existed a father carrying grief long before the world turned against him. George Foreman. George Foreman built his reputation as one of the most intimidating fighters in boxing history. Born in Texas in 1949, Foreman rose from poverty and troubled streets to become a two-time world heavyweight champion, an Olympic gold medalist, and later a beloved television personality known around the world. During the 1970s, his devastating punching power terrified opponents inside the ring, while his legendary fight against Muhammad Ali in the famous Rumble in the Jungle became one of the most iconic moments in sports history. To the public, George Foreman looked indestructible, a giant of strength, confidence, and resilience. But behind the success stood a father who experienced unimaginable heartbreak. On March 9, 2019, Foreman's daughter, Frida Foreman, was found dead at her home in Texas at only 42 years old. Authorities later ruled her death a suicide by hanging. The tragedy shocked fans because Frida had once followed her father's path into boxing before stepping away from the sport to focus on family life. For George Foreman, the pain became overwhelming. Frida was not only his daughter, but also one of the children closest to his public legacy. Friends later described Foreman as emotionally devastated after losing her so suddenly. A man who had survived brutal fights and decades of fame suddenly faced grief no strength could overcome. What made the tragedy even more painful was how unexpected it felt. To outsiders, Frida appeared to have a stable life, family support, and a recognizable name connected to success. But behind closed doors, emotional struggles remained hidden until it was too late. George Foreman later shared heartfelt tributes, describing Frida as loving, loyal, and deeply important to their family. Behind the smiling television personality and former champion stood a grieving father forced to live with the haunting reality that he could not protect his own daughter from inner pain that no one fully saw coming. Julius Erving. Julius Erving changed basketball long before the modern NBA became filled with high-flying superstars. Born in New York in 1950, Erving, known worldwide as Dr. J, revolutionized the game with creativity, elegance, and athleticism that audiences had never seen before. His spectacular dunks, smooth style, and leadership made him one of the most admired players in basketball history. By the late 1970s and 1980s, Julius Erving was not just a sports icon, but a cultural symbol respected far beyond the court. To fans, Dr. J appeared calm, disciplined, and larger than life. But behind the fame was a father who suffered a devastating loss that permanently changed him. On May 28, 2000, Erving's 19-year-old son, Corey Erving, disappeared while driving in Florida after returning home from college. Days later, authorities discovered his vehicle submerged in a pond. Corey had drowned after the car accidentally entered the water during heavy rain conditions. The tragedy shattered Julius Erving emotionally. Friends later described him as heartbroken and deeply withdrawn after the loss. Corey was young, intelligent, and full of promise, with an entire future ahead of him. For a father who had spent years inspiring millions through discipline and confidence, the helplessness became unbearable. What made the story especially haunting was the loneliness surrounding Corey's final moments. Alone in the dark, trapped inside a submerged vehicle, his life ended before anyone could reach him. The image haunted Erving for years afterward. Although Julius Erving eventually returned to public life, people close to him noticed lasting sadness behind his calm smile. The basketball legend who once soared effortlessly above defenders suddenly became a grieving father, carrying pain no championship or achievement could ever erase. Afeni Shakur. Afeni Shakur spent her life fighting battles most people could never survive. Born in North Carolina in 1947, she became known as a political activist connected to the Black Panther Party before later becoming the mother of one of the most influential rappers in history, Tupac Shakur. Afeni raised Tupac through poverty, instability, and constant struggle, teaching him about black pride, resistance, and survival long before fame entered their lives. Even as Tupac became a global superstar during the 1990s, Afeni remained one of the most important emotional figures in his world. But behind Tupac's success was a growing sense of danger surrounding his life. Legal troubles, violence, public feuds, and non-stop pressure followed him everywhere. Afeni reportedly worried constantly about her son as his fame grew larger and more chaotic. Then came the night that changed everything forever. On September 7, 1996, Tupac was shot multiple times while riding in a car in Las Vegas after attending a boxing match. For nearly a week, Afeni watched her son fight for his life inside a hospital room while millions around the world waited desperately for good news. But on September 13th, Tupac died at only 25 years old. The tragedy destroyed Afeni emotionally. Friends later described her as heartbroken beyond words after losing the son she had struggled so hard to protect throughout his life. Tupac was not just a celebrity to her, he was her child, her purpose, and the person who carried many of her own dreams into the world through music and activism. Even after his death, Afeni spent years protecting Tupac's legacy, managing his estate and keeping his voice alive for future generations. But behind her public strength remained the pain of a mother forced to bury her own son while the entire world watched. Afeni Shakur died in 2016, but many people believe part of her spirit was broken the moment Tupac's life ended in that Las Vegas hospital room nearly 20 years earlier. Eddie Levert. Eddie Levert spent decades giving soul music some of its most unforgettable voices and emotional performances. Born in Alabama in 1942, Eddie became the legendary frontman of the OJs, helping create timeless classics like Love Train, Backstabbers, and For the Love of Money. His powerful vocals and commanding stage presence made him one of the most respected figures in R&B history. To audiences, Eddie Levert represented strength, experience, and musical excellence built over generations. But behind the legendary career was a father repeatedly devastated by personal tragedy. On November 10, 2006, Eddie's son, Gerald Levert, died suddenly at just 40 years old. Gerald had become a major R&B star himself, admired for hits like Baby Hold On to Me and Casanova. Talented, charismatic, and deeply loved by fans, Gerald appeared to have an incredible future ahead of him. The cause of death was later linked to a fatal combination of prescription medications. The news shocked the music world because Gerald seemed far too young and successful for such a sudden ending. For Eddie Levert, the pain became unbearable. He did not only lose a son, he lost a musical partner, a close friend, and part of his own legacy. Friends later described Eddie as emotionally shattered after Gerald's death. Yet tragedy struck again years later when another son, Sean Levert, died in 2008 while incarcerated. Losing two sons within such a short period left Eddie carrying unimaginable grief beneath the image of a legendary performer. What makes Eddie Levert's story especially heartbreaking is how deeply family and music were connected in his life. The voices that once brought joy to millions became tied forever to memories of loss, grief, and the unbearable silence left behind after two sons disappeared far too soon. Tamika Foster. Tamika Foster built a respected name in the fashion and entertainment world long before tragedy transformed her life forever. Known as a celebrity stylist connected to major stars and high-profile events, Tamika appeared confident, successful, and deeply connected to the glamorous side of the music industry. But behind the cameras and celebrity lifestyle was a devoted mother whose world collapsed after losing her young son in one of the most heartbreaking accidents involving a celebrity family in recent memory. On July 6, 2012, Tamika's 11-year-old son, Kyle Glover, was spending time with friends on Lake Lanier in Georgia during what should have been a peaceful summer outing. While riding an inflatable tube on the water, Kyle was struck by a jet ski traveling at high speed. The collision caused catastrophic injuries to his head and body, leaving him unconscious instantly. Kyle was rushed to the hospital and placed on life support. For days, Tamika remained beside her son, praying for a miracle, while family members held on to fading hope. Doctors eventually confirmed Kyle had suffered irreversible brain damage. On July 21, 2012, after nearly 2 weeks in critical condition, Kyle passed away. The tragedy shattered Tamika emotionally. Friends later described her as completely broken after losing the child she adored so deeply. Unlike many celebrity stories built around scandal or controversy, this was pure heartbreak. A mother watching her son disappear because of a sudden accident nobody expected. The emotional impact became even larger publicly because Kyle was also closely connected to Usher, who had helped raise him during his marriage to Tamika. The entire tragedy played out under intense media attention, making the grief even harder to endure privately. What makes Tamika Foster's story especially painful is the randomness of it all. One normal summer afternoon turned into a nightmare that permanently changed an entire family. Behind the celebrity lifestyle stood a grieving mother, forced to continue living after losing one of the most important parts of her world. Nick Cannon. Nick Cannon spent years building a career around humor, energy, and non-stop ambition. Born in California in 1980, Cannon became one of entertainment's most recognizable personalities through television hosting, comedy, music, radio, and business ventures. From Wild 'N Out to major hosting roles and high-profile relationships, Nick built an image of confidence and charisma that kept him constantly in the public eye. But behind the fast-paced celebrity lifestyle was a father carrying unimaginable grief after losing one of his youngest children. In 2021, Nick Cannon revealed that his 5-month-old son, Zen Cannon, had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of brain cancer known as hydrocephalus. Doctors discovered fluid building dangerously inside the infant's brain, forcing emergency surgeries and painful treatments while the family desperately searched for hope. Nick later spoke emotionally about watching his son fight for life during those final months. Despite medical efforts, Zen's condition worsened rapidly. In December 2021, Cannon publicly announced that his son had died at only 5 months old. The news shocked fans because Nick, usually energetic and humorous in public, appeared emotionally devastated while speaking about the loss. During interviews and television appearances, his voice often cracked as he described holding Zen for the final time beside the ocean shortly before his death. What made the tragedy especially heartbreaking was how openly Nick discussed the emotional pain afterward. Rather than hiding behind celebrity image or pride, he admitted the experience completely changed his understanding of life, fatherhood, and grief. Friends close to him later described a man trying to stay strong publicly while privately carrying enormous emotional weight. Behind the jokes, television success, and fame stood a grieving father, forced to accept that even unlimited resources and medical care could not save the child he loved. Nick Cannon's story reminds people that tragedy does not care about fame, money, or celebrity status. Grief arrives the same way for everyone. Usher. Usher built one of the most successful careers in modern R&B through talent, discipline, and non-stop dedication. Born in Texas in 1978 and raised in Atlanta, Usher became a global superstar with legendary hits like Yeah, Burn, Confessions Part 2, and You Got It Bad. During the 2000s, albums like Confessions sold millions worldwide and transformed him into one of the biggest entertainers on earth. On stage, Usher appeared smooth, confident, and completely in control, the image of a polished superstar living a perfect life. But behind the fame came a tragedy that deeply affected him emotionally and personally. During his marriage to Tamika Foster, Usher became closely connected to her two sons and reportedly developed a strong fatherly bond with them, especially Kyle Glover. Then, in July 2012, everything changed after a horrific jet ski accident on Lake Lanier in Georgia. Kyle, only 11 years old, suffered catastrophic injuries after being struck while riding an inflatable tube in the water. He was rushed to the hospital and placed on life support while family members desperately hoped for recovery. After nearly 2 weeks in critical condition, Kyle died from his injuries. The tragedy devastated the family and deeply affected Usher as well. Friends later described him as emotionally shattered behind the scenes while still trying to remain strong publicly. Although media attention focused heavily on legal disputes and family tension afterward, the emotional reality remained heartbreaking. A child full of life was suddenly gone forever. What made the situation even more painful was how publicly the grief unfolded. Paparazzi, headlines, and courtroom drama surrounded a tragedy that should have remained deeply personal. Behind the polished celebrity image stood a man mourning the loss of a child he loved while trying to navigate public scrutiny at the same time. Usher's story reminds people that fame cannot shield families from sudden tragedy. No amount of success, money, or celebrity influence could undo the devastating moment that changed everyone connected to Kyle Glover forever. Lamar Odom. Lamar Odom spent years appearing to live the dream. Born in New York in 1979, Odom became an NBA star known for his rare versatility, winning 2 championships with the Los Angeles Lakers alongside Kobe Bryant. Fans admired Lamar because he combined talent, humility, and emotional openness in ways many athletes rarely showed publicly. His marriage to Khloe Kardashian later turned him into a major celebrity beyond basketball, bringing even more attention into his personal life. But long before reality television fame, Lamar experienced a devastating tragedy that permanently scarred him emotionally. In 2006, his 6-month-old son, Jaden Odom, died unexpectedly from sudden infant death syndrome while sleeping in his crib in New York. The loss completely destroyed Lamar emotionally. Friends later described him as overwhelmed by grief and unable to fully process the pain. Many people close to Odom believe the tragedy became one of the major emotional turning points that contributed to his later struggles with depression, addiction, and self-destructive behavior. Unlike public scandals that filled headlines years later, Jaden's death revealed a deeply vulnerable side of Lamar rarely discussed openly. Behind the fame, luxury lifestyle, and championship success stood a grieving father carrying emotional wounds he never truly escaped. What makes Lamar Odom's story especially heartbreaking is how helpless the situation felt. There was no violence, no warning, and nobody to blame. One moment his infant son was alive, and the next his entire world collapsed silently overnight. Years later, Lamar admitted that losing Jaden remained one of the most painful experiences of his entire life. Even after surviving overdoses, public humiliation, and career collapse, he continued describing the death of his son as the emotional pain that haunted him the most. Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton experienced a tragedy so devastating that it changed both his life and music forever. Born in England in 1945, Clapton became one of the greatest guitarists in rock history through legendary work with bands like Cream and timeless songs such as Layla, Wonderful Tonight, and Tears in Heaven. By the late 1980s, he had already survived addiction, alcoholism, and years of emotional turmoil while building a career admired around the world. To fans, Clapton looked like a music legend who had endured every storm imaginable. But nothing prepared him for the loss of his young son. On March 20th, 1991, Clapton's 4-year-old son, Connor Clapton, died after falling from the 53rd floor window of a Manhattan apartment building in New York City. The horrifying accident happened in only seconds after a housekeeper accidentally left a window open during cleaning. The tragedy completely shattered Eric Clapton emotionally. Friends later described him as broken by grief and unable to process how suddenly his child had disappeared. Before the accident, Clapton had reportedly been trying to become a more present father and rebuild his relationship with Connor after years of addiction and touring kept him emotionally distant. Losing his son just as that bond was growing made the pain even more unbearable. Out of that grief came one of the most emotional songs ever written. Clapton poured his heartbreak into Tears in Heaven, a ballad asking whether his son would remember him in the afterlife. The song touched millions around the world because the pain inside it felt painfully real. What makes Eric Clapton's story especially heartbreaking is the unimaginable randomness of the tragedy. One ordinary morning changed everything forever. Behind the legendary guitarist stood a grieving father carrying a loss so deep that even decades later, many fans still hear the sorrow hidden inside every word of Tears in Heaven. John Travolta. John Travolta spent decades as one of Hollywood's most recognizable stars. Born in New Jersey in 1954, Travolta rose to worldwide fame through iconic films like Saturday Night Fever, Grease, Pulp Fiction, and Face Slash Off. His charisma, charm, and versatility made him a major celebrity across generations, while audiences admired his ability to reinvent himself repeatedly throughout his career. To the public, John Travolta appeared successful, wealthy, and surrounded by a loving family life away from Hollywood chaos. But behind the fame came a tragedy that permanently changed him. On January 2, 2009, Travolta's 16-year-old son, Jet Travolta, died while the family vacationed in the Bahamas. Jet, who reportedly had a history of seizures linked to autism and Kawasaki disease, suffered a seizure inside the family's hotel residence and struck his head during the fall. The loss devastated John Travolta and his wife, Kelly Preston. Friends later described Travolta as emotionally destroyed after losing the son he deeply adored. Jet had remained at the center of the family's life for years, and John often spoke privately about his love and protectiveness toward him. What made the tragedy especially painful was how suddenly everything happened. The family had simply been enjoying a holiday together when their world collapsed overnight. Fans who saw Travolta smiling publicly during earlier vacation photos had no idea they were witnessing the final days before unimaginable heartbreak. Although Travolta eventually returned to acting, people close to him noticed a lasting sadness after Jet's death. Years later, he admitted losing a child was the worst pain a parent could ever experience. Behind the Hollywood fame, awards, and success stood a grieving father forced to continue living after losing the son who meant everything to him. Even today, many fans believe John Travolta was never truly the same again after that tragedy. Sylvester Stallone. Sylvester Stallone spent his life portraying fighters who refused to quit. Born in New York City in 1946, Stallone rose from rejection and poverty to become one of Hollywood's greatest action stars through legendary films like Rocky, Rambo, and Creed. His story inspired millions because he transformed struggle into triumph, creating characters built around resilience, determination, and survival. To audiences, Stallone appeared tough, disciplined, and emotionally unbreakable, the kind of man who could survive anything life placed in front of him. But behind the fame was a father forced to endure one of the most devastating losses imaginable. On July 13, 2012, Stallone's eldest son, Sage Stallone, was found dead inside his Los Angeles apartment at only 36 years old. Sage had followed his father into acting and even appeared alongside him in Rocky V. Quiet, intelligent, and passionate about film, Sage reportedly maintained a close emotional bond with his father, despite living mostly away from Hollywood attention. The sudden death shocked the entertainment world. Initial media speculation created chaos online, but authorities later confirmed Sage died from heart disease caused by atherosclerosis. Prescription pain medication was present, though not ruled the official cause of death. For Sylvester Stallone, the loss became emotionally devastating. Friends later described him as completely shattered behind the scenes while trying to remain composed publicly. A man famous for portraying strength suddenly faced grief no amount of toughness could defeat. What made the tragedy especially painful was how personal and private Sage had been. Unlike many celebrity children, he rarely chased fame or controversy. His death felt sudden, quiet, and deeply heartbreaking. Stallone later admitted that losing a child changes a parent forever. Behind the muscles, fame, and legendary movie career stood a grieving father trying to survive the kind of emotional pain that no action hero can escape in real life. Joe Jackson. Joe Jackson built one of the most influential musical families in history, but his life was also marked by painful personal tragedy long before the world knew the name the Jackson 5. Born in Arkansas in 1928, Joe became famous as the strict and demanding patriarch who transformed his children into global superstars. Under his leadership, the Jackson family rose from humble beginnings in Gary, Indiana, to worldwide fame through relentless rehearsals, discipline, and ambition. To the public, Joe Jackson appeared tough, controlling, and emotionally distant, a man obsessed with success at any cost. But behind the famous family story was a deeply painful loss that haunted the Jackson household for years. In 1957, Joe and his wife, Katherine Jackson, lost their infant son, Brandon Jackson, shortly after birth. Brandon was the twin brother of Marlon Jackson, but survived only a single day due to complications related to premature birth. The tragedy happened years before the family achieved fame, during a period when the Jacksons were still struggling financially and emotionally. Although Joe rarely showed vulnerability publicly, people close to the family later suggested the loss deeply affected both parents. Katherine especially carried the emotional pain throughout her life, often speaking quietly about Brandon in later years. What makes the story especially heartbreaking is that Brandon's existence is often forgotten because of the overwhelming fame surrounding the Jackson family. Before the records, sold-out concerts, and worldwide success, there was already grief inside that household. For Joe Jackson, the loss represented something deeply human beneath the harsh public image. Behind the strict father and controversial manager stood a parent who experienced the devastating pain of burying a child long before fame ever entered the family's life. Even decades later, Brandon remained a quiet reminder that tragedy touched the Jackson family long before the spotlight arrived. Robert Plant. Robert Plant spent decades standing at the center of rock music history as the legendary voice of Led Zeppelin. Born in England in 1948, Plant became famous through timeless songs like Stairway to Heaven, Kashmir, and Whole Lotta Love. During the 1970s, Led Zeppelin dominated the world with massive tours, record-breaking albums, and a level of fame few bands had ever experienced. To fans, Robert Plant looked untouchable, a wild rock star living inside a dream filled with music, success, and endless applause. But behind the fame came a tragedy that permanently changed his life forever. On July 26, 1977, Plant's 5-year-old son, Carrick Plant, died suddenly from a severe stomach virus while Robert was away touring in the United States. The illness developed rapidly, and despite medical treatment, the little boy passed away unexpectedly. The news devastated Plant emotionally. Friends later described him as completely shattered after learning his son had died while he was thousands of miles away performing concerts. At the height of Led Zeppelin's success, Robert suddenly found himself questioning fame, touring, and even music itself. The loss became so painful that Led Zeppelin temporarily stopped major activities, while Plant withdrew emotionally from public life. Many fans later noticed a darker, emotional tone in his music after the tragedy. Songs written during later years often carried grief, reflection, and emotional vulnerability that had not been as visible before. What makes Robert Plant's story especially heartbreaking is the helplessness surrounding the moment. While crowds celebrated him as one of rock's greatest stars, his son was fighting for life at home. By the time Plant returned, everything had already changed forever. Behind the legendary voice and rock star image stood a grieving father carrying guilt, heartbreak, and the unbearable reality that fame could never protect the people he loved most. Dwayne Wade. Dwayne Wade built a career defined by leadership, determination, and loyalty. Born in Chicago in 1982, Wade became one of the greatest shooting guards in NBA history through his legendary years with the Miami Heat. Winning 3 NBA championships alongside stars like LeBron James and Chris Bosh, Wade earned worldwide respect for his toughness, athleticism, and ability to perform under pressure. Off the court, fans admired him as a devoted father and family-oriented public figure. But behind the successful image came devastating family tragedy. On August 31, 2020, Wade's 15-year-old cousin, Zaire Wade's cousin Nikia Aldridge, often publicly connected to Wade's extended family tragedy discussions, continued to keep attention on the earlier murder of Wade's cousin Nikia Aldridge in Chicago, who had been shot and killed in 2016 while pushing her baby in a stroller. The senseless violence deeply affected Wade and his entire family. Although Nikia was Wade's cousin rather than daughter, the emotional impact became intensely personal because Wade often described the pain of watching family members become victims of violence in the communities where he grew up. The tragedy forced him to speak publicly about gun violence, grief, and the fear many Black families experience daily. What made the situation especially heartbreaking was the complete innocence of the victim. Nikia was not involved in criminal activity and was simply walking through her neighborhood when gunfire erupted nearby. Behind the championships, fame, and success stood a man grieving for family members lost to violence that continues destroying communities across America. Wade's story reminds people that celebrity status cannot erase pain or protect loved ones from sudden tragedy. Prince Harry. Prince Harry grew up inside one of the most famous families on earth, but behind the royal image was a child carrying unimaginable grief. Born in London in 1984 as the younger son of King Charles III and Princess Diana, Harry spent his early years under constant public attention. To millions around the world, the young prince appeared privileged, protected, and surrounded by luxury. But everything changed forever in August 1997. On August 31, 1997, Princess Diana died in a car crash in Paris after being pursued by paparazzi. Harry was only 12 years old. The tragedy instantly became one of the most shocking moments in modern history, with billions of people around the world mourning Diana's death. For Harry, however, it was not global history. It was the loss of his mother. One of the most heartbreaking images ever captured showed young Harry walking behind Diana's coffin during the funeral procession beside his brother, Prince William. Millions watched the silent child trying to remain composed while grieving publicly in front of the entire world. Years later, Harry openly admitted the trauma deeply damaged him emotionally. He described years of buried anger, depression, panic attacks, and emotional numbness while struggling to process his mother's death under relentless media attention. Unlike ordinary children allowed to grieve privately, Harry experienced loss while cameras documented every expression on his face. What makes Prince Harry's story especially painful is how public the tragedy became. The world mourned Princess Diana as an icon, but behind the headlines stood a young boy who simply lost his mother far too early. Even decades later, Harry continues speaking openly about mental health and grief, showing how the emotional wounds from that night in Paris never fully disappeared. These celebrities conquered fame, wealth, championships, and global success. Yet none of it could protect them from the unbearable pain of losing a child. From Mike Tyson and Bobby Brown to Dr. Dre, Master P, and John Travolta, each of these heartbreaking stories reveals a side of celebrity life the public rarely sees. Behind the smiles, interviews, and red carpets were grieving parents trying desperately to survive emotional pain no family should ever experience. Some lost children to accidents, addiction, violence, or sudden illness, while others spent years blaming themselves for tragedies they could never prevent. And maybe that is what makes these stories so devastating, because grief does not care about fame or fortune. Which celebrity story affected you the most emotionally? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to Memory Lane Black People for more emotional untold stories.